You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo first looked at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Writers have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, an award-winning filmmaker, self-professed book nerd, and creator of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. This podcast is for anyone who loves books, loves authors, loves France, or any combination therein. Each week, I'll speak with an author whose life, stories, or characters have a connection to France. Then these amoureux de livres will treat us to a reading from their book. What would happen if you and your bestie decided to secretly crawl into each other's beds and seduce each other's husbands without them knowing? That's the premise behind author Lily Samson's debut thriller, The Switch. And of course, there's something more sinister afoot. The Switch is a fast-paced, wild ride that I could not put down. In this season 7 finale, Lily shares how she knew what to reveal and when, the allure of social status, and what inspired this story in the first place. Please allow me to introduce Lily Samson, author of The Switch. Hello, Lily. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
I am very excited to talk to you about The Switch. But before we get into all of that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Oh, so I'm Lily Samson. I live in London some of the time and in Paris some of the time because my partner, who I've been with since we got together in the pandemic, so that would be the summer of 2020, he lives in Paris and he teaches at the Sorbonne. So I'm a writer and I'm often seen writing on the Eurostar as I go back and forth.
That was going to be my next question, whether you have a connection to Paris or to France, but I suppose you do.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, when I got together with my partner, it came about because I was drawing portraits in the pandemic. So I was just drawing portraits of various writers or people I knew due to just sort of fill the empty evenings. And so I approached him because I knew him vaguely and I said, can I draw your portrait? And some of my portraits went a bit awry, but this one was quite flattering. So he really liked it and that kick-started things.
That's such a romantic story. It also seemed like kind of a line, like it could go either way. Like, hey, can I draw your picture?
Yeah, I know. Well, fortunately, I think most people feel quite flattered if you ask them. Not always flattered if they see the result. If it goes a bit wrong, as some of them did. But yeah, his one came out. His one was very flattering. So he was very pleased and he put it up on social media repeatedly.
Oh, that's nice. So can you tell us a little bit about The Switch? What is that about?
So The Switch is a dark domestic thriller, a sexy thriller about an outrageous premise. It was inspired by a short story by Roald Dahl called Switch Bitch, which I read when I was a teenager because I grew up loving Roald Dahl, about two men who secretly swap wives in the dark in secret without them knowing. The men live opposite each other on the same street. And that story always stayed with me. And it's one of his twist in the tail stories. And so I sort of thought, well, it would be interesting to reverse the sexes and do the feminist version about two women who concoct to do this. So that was the starting point. And then as the book unfolds, we realize that behind this sexy game, there's another game that's being played out, which leads to a backstory involving lies and deceit and murder and so on. So it's sort of a mix of a sort of more classic thriller and also this kind of sexy game which plays out, which is a little bit dangerous liaisons.
Yeah, definitely. Was this a story that had been brewing in your mind for a long time?
No. So there, like, as I've sort of mentioned, Roald Dahl and Dangerous Liaisons, my favourite film is Dangerous Liaisons from 1998. So all these influences have obviously been there a long time. If I was going to write a thriller, it was going to definitely be this thriller. But I came up with it quite spontaneously. So I find it quite hard to write at home because I'm a carer for an elderly parent. So I'm always out in cafes writing with my notebook, and I've become acclimatized to that now. And it was July 2021, and I sat down with my notebook and I had decided I was inspired. I decided I wanted to write a thriller. I had just started reading them. By that, I mean, I was kind of excited by the evolution of the genre because we've moved on perhaps from police procedurals, which are just not to my taste. I know they're hugely popular, and perhaps more of the sort of Hollywood action hero thrillers towards this kind of union between women's fiction and thrillers, the birth of the domestic thriller, which Julia Crouch, who made up the term domestic thriller, has sort of deemed this kind of interesting space which explores a lot about women's fears and issues, you know, issues such as divorce or deceit or lies or affairs and so on, and so plays with them in the thriller genre. So I was really interested in that genre. So I just sat down on that day in July and brainstormed ideas. And so this was maybe idea number 4. And the moment I
Oh,
thought it up, I
wow.
was like, yes, this is it. And then also, this doesn't always happen. It certainly didn't happen with my second thriller. That day, I sat down and I just planned out the whole thing because I like to plan books in 3 acts initially. And I just had the whole thing, and I had the twist at the end and everything. It was all just there. The whole book was completely clear in my mind. So that was the starting point. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I was going to ask about the ending and how much of it you knew because it does get very twisty and turny at the end. I was curious about that.
So I definitely knew where that big twist at the end, which people have very divisive reactions to, because it's a little bit of a shock or not. Some people get, and some people are appalled, and some people are like, wow. Yeah, I knew that from the start. So I knew where I was heading. Yeah.
Very interesting. And speaking of the structure of the book, so the structure I find very interesting because you've divided this book into 5 parts. And the first part is it Elena or Elena? How would you say her name?
I say Eleanor.
Elena. Okay, so it's Elena then and now. And then the next few parts from 2 to 5 are back and forth, sort of, between Elena and Sophia, although we're mostly with Elena. And I was curious about that. Had you played around with other structures?
Yes. So, I mean, yeah, this is interesting. So, in that summer, I spent a month and I wrote about 20,000 words. I wrote an opening, and the agent who I was with, my former agent, if you like, I sent it to her. She liked the idea because, it was so interesting. But I sent her that material, and it was just a kind of straightforward description of like how Eleanor and Sophia, because Eleanor and Adam, the couple, they moved to Wimbledon, and it's this lovely, wealthy area. They've got this house sit in Wimbledon Village. And then Eleanor meets Sophia, who's very glamorous and gorgeous. And Sophia is married to Finn, and they're this sort of very shiny, charismatic, enticing couple. So the opening was really all about how they meet, and obviously it's gonna it takes a while before Sophia can introduce the idea of the switch and say to Eleanor, let's try this crazy idea. So it was kind of quite a slow opening, and I knew there was something wrong with it, and I sent it to my previous agent, and 6 months had gone by and she hadn't got back to me, and I just lost confidence in the book, and I just thought, well, I just it's not really working as a thriller, so I just kind of binned it. But often when you let go of an idea, it's in your subconscious is still beavering away at it. And then just I was in London in Waterstones Piccadilly, and I thought, no, I've got this great idea. I'm going to just start right in the middle of things, and I'm going to start with them doing the switch in that first moment and describe how they're plotting and planning and that night when it first happens, and then have these flashbacks to how they managed to agree to this. So that's kind of how that structure came about. And then the change of agent helped, because my present agent, Catherine Summerhays, is just brilliant. And the moment I told her the idea, she loved it. And I read the opening and she loved it. And I think that when you just have one person behind you, and that's all you need as a writer, your agent or a friend or a partner who really believes in it. I just needed that, and she gave it to me. So then I wrote it really quickly in a frenzy in the space of 3 months.
Wow. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you need someone who believes so much in the idea that they can have the perspective to see what needs to be fixed if it's just a structural thing. Because when you are writing it and you are so close to it, or you're fixated on one idea because this is the way that you've already done it, you sort of need someone else who's like, this is great. Let's just figure out what's missing or what can be fixed and get it done.
I think, yeah, because otherwise, as I say, you can fix it yourself by almost putting it in the drawer and forgetting about it. But that's quite a slow process. If you're left to yourself to just, you sense something's wrong, it's so much quicker if someone can locate the issue for you and say, this is what needs work. So yeah.
Absolutely. And as a creative person, it's always hard to fight the voice that says, this isn't good enough, you're not good enough, this isn't a good idea. So it's also
Yeah.
quite easy to put something in a drawer and just keep it
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the structure works really well. I think it works perfectly. I think if the whole book had gone from present to past, it would have lost its steam, I think. But without
Mm.
it starting that way, I think we wouldn't have understood what was happening. We got to jump in and also sort of puzzle it out. And then we kind of understand what's happening the moment we jump into part two. So I think it all worked really well.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the comments that I've read over and over about this book is that it escalated really quickly, which I think it did, which I think is great because it made me want to keep reading and keep going. How challenging was it to know what to reveal when?
Hmm, that's interesting. It was hard because in the version that I first gave to Catherine, after those 3 months, I put in little seeds for the twist at the end, because I had kind of underestimated the fact that most readers these days, they're really savvy, like they just pick up on things. So actually, you can't necessarily leave a trail of crumbs in a domestic thriller, because they just follow the trail, and they're kind of trying to second guess you all the time. So I just remember that, like, these little clues, which I can't obviously go into the detail because it's going to spoil the twist, but they had to be removed. As I say, I'm still quite new to the thriller genre, but you can't leave that trail of crumbs towards the conclusion. In fact, you have to misdirect and give clues and hints that leads the reader in the wrong direction. But that was something I was still learning with that first thriller. So that was something I had to grapple with. But again, I am like such a big fan of structure when it comes to writing. And I kind of feel like, as I said, initially I did a 3-act structure, but the reason there are 5 parts is because I do like a 5-act structure when it comes to writing. And there's that really great book, John Yorke's Into the Woods. He analyzes how the 5-act structure works. And so he looks at, say, Shakespeare's Macbeth and E.T. and being John Malkovich, and how it applies to all of them. And there's quite a lot of those books out there, but I think his one's really special because the problem is often when you've got 3 acts, you've got a soggy middle, and things kind of slow down, and the beginning you've got a lot of initial steam, and then the end you've got your finale, but that middle can kind of dip. And I think that 5-act structure helps to deal with that.
Yeah, because oftentimes you'll get distracted by a B story and then you're like, well, what is happening in the A story? Like what's
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's interesting because I think structure is so important to just kind of hold the story. But then, as you say, you don't want to be too clinical about it either. You've got to allow room for your imagination to wander into unexpected places and things to surprise you, and for there to be those dreamlike moments that just sort of enter the book and you can't even explain, but they just feel like they really capture the characters. Yeah.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may also enjoy my podcast, City of Muses. Each week, I chat with contemporary artists and creatives to explore what inspires them. where their creativity comes from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. I think it's really interesting what you say, too, about thrillers and breadcrumbing, because you're right. I love thrillers. I consume them. I read lots and lots and lots. And there's nothing more disappointing than guessing the ending at the beginning. And I think, because I grew up with mysteries and procedurals and all these sorts of things. So that the clues are there in the beginning and you're working out the problem by the end, and then you're like, oh, did I get it right? A big check or an X or whatever. And so I think that you're right that misdirection is important, but it's a difficult balance, I imagine, because the reveals also can't come from nowhere, because that's also not satisfying.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the good thing about an interesting idea like this is like, I could then allow it to be reasonably character driven, because it's like, well, because it's such a crazy setup. So once they've done the first switch, Sophia says to Eleanor, well, that's it, and we're not going to talk about it. But inevitably, once you've done that once, there's a hunger. You've set up this interesting experience, because Eleanor has this sexual awakening. She's in a quite flat, dull relationship with her partner Adam, and they're kind of, it's not that it's bad, but it's not great. They're kind of ticking along, and there are these problems that have always been there. Well, every relationship has its shadows. So she has this kind of amazing experience, but then it's very difficult because, well, the women are wondering, well, do the men know? So that introduces ambiguity, and it's like, are we going to do it again? So there's this sense of inevitability as well, I think, about their actions, that you kind of think, well, they probably are going to discuss doing it again, but if they try another switch, with every time they do it, there's going to be greater risk of being caught, and then they're wondering, well, are we getting away with it? Do the men know? Because obviously it's quite far-fetched that they don't. So maybe they're kind of teasing us, or we're all playing games and so on. So
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too, this idea of like the long-term relationship and keeping it fresh versus sort of like settling with the person that you're with. And we're sort of examining those questions at the same time as we're examining everything else, which I think is also really interesting.
yeah, so I guess, yes, it's kind of looking, I suppose, at the sort of the allure of this kind of adventure that's sort of so dangerous and risky. So you've got sex and fear combined together in this switch, and there's all this risk. And as I say, Eleanor has this amazing sexual awakening, but she then feels very kind of weird, because she then meets up with the guy she's had this experience with, and she's thinking, but he has no idea. It's sort of a weird sort of moment for her, and it's like an overwhelming experience, but at the same time it's quite ephemeral, so she can't really know what it would be like in real life. And so I guess it's this conflict. It's like, do you kind of stay with what's safe and your security net, or do you take a leap forward and try something new? But it's so complicated, because then she's locked into this really difficult situation, because if she tries to pursue him, she's pursuing her friend's husband, and that's betraying her friend, and they've set up this game together. So,
Well, yes. And also there's the idea of illusion versus reality. We often build up relationships in our minds. This man is so beautiful. He's so perfect.
yeah.
A relationship with him would be ideal, but that isn't necessarily what will actually happen, because people are, not just fantasies, they're real.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that was kind of what I was trying to say, but my brain wasn't working.
No, you said it. Social status also plays a big part in this book.
Yeah, yeah.
Elena really wants very badly to be a part of this higher social echelon that she sees Sophia and Finn in. I think also there's this idea in the back of like our collective minds, like sort of an eyes wide shut world where the rich and the glamorous play in this arena that we, the real people, don't play in.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, because I definitely, I mean, the class thing came from like personal experience, because I grew up in a working class family. I don't sound like that, but that's because of my education. But like I grew up in a really poor family and my parents hadn't been to university. And because it was like the 70s and it was like a time when there was a lot more social mobility, like my parents were doing quite well. And then my dad got ill when I was 3 and he developed schizophrenia. And then we were like on benefits. And then I just did well at school and got into Oxford, which was like a really exciting moment. But then I arrived from a very different background from 90% of the people there. So I'm just always really fascinated by the differences between the classes because they're kind of very subtle. But having moved from one class to another, just about, that it just really interests me. So what I did with Eleanor was that basically Eleanor, that element of her is based on me because she's from a similar situation. She's from like a poor family, but she went to Cambridge. And then she perceives Sophia as being sophisticated from a different class. So there's a sort of aspiration there. And Sophia plays on that. She senses and detects a weakness, and it takes her a while to register. But then there's this kind of class comedy as well, because, Adam is trying to Adam's middle class, but he's trying to look kind of cool and kind of grungy, and it's kind of trying to dress up. And because I've been in that situation dating wise, where you're both trying to pretend you're of a different class, and that's also quite funny. So yeah.
And there's sort of a co-conspiracy between Adam and Elena too, where they both like are complicit in this idea that they are in a class that they're not actually really in. They're both pretending that they are some sort of illusion for Sophia and Finn, but they both agree to this illusion.
Yes, that's true, because they pretend that they're not house sitting for Adam's aunt. They pretend that they kind of are renting or that they own the property to try and make out that well, effectively, if you're living in Wimbledon Village, you'd be a millionaire. And just what you say, I really liked what you said, about the eyes wide shut world that they possibly live in, because I have walked through Wimbledon Village where I have done some writing from time to time, and yeah, like you looking through the windows and they've got these amazing houses there, just so beautiful, and you do wonder what's going on and behind them, and you wonder if they are, like, obviously we project onto them that they have these perfect happy lives, but obviously they don't. They must have their own challenges, problems, because everyone's grappling with something. For them, it's not poverty, but it's probably something else. But yeah, I like the idea of the eyes wide shut, secret world behind those closed doors. Yeah, because I suppose it's like the association of the aristocracy with decadence and so on.
Yes, aristocracy, decadence, but also beauty, because to be invited to these masked balls or whatever, you're usually beautiful and elegant and alluring and sexual and sexy and all of that too. So
yeah, no.
It's like all of these aspirational qualities.
Yeah, that's true. I definitely think, as you say, like Sophia is kind of mixing all those things into one game. And as I said, Dangerous Liaisons, the book and the film were an influence. I'm really fascinated by that book. So yes, again, that was all about bored aristocrats who have too much time on their hands, and so they become very bored, very cynical, and they're sort of playing these games of deceit. And then what I really love about the book and the film is that sort of shift from cynicism to sincerity, because love and the way that love becomes a disruptive force in the book and the film of Dangerous Liaisons. Because Christopher Hampton, who adapted it for play and screen, he kind of said in a lot of books and films, love is a redemption, whereas in Dangerous Liaisons, it's a kind of disruptive, destructive force. It's very purifying and it's cathartic, but it kind of disrupts their kind of idle cynicism. And I think in The Switch, I wanted to achieve something like that too. Like, Sophia's not cynical. She actually has a plot in mind that comes from a very deep place. And she's, in her own twisted logic, she persuaded herself that this switch is just the right thing to do to achieve her goal. And because of her past, she's kind of been brought up to play games and be manipulative, and so on. But yeah, I just like the idea of love as something which enters these games and becomes a disruption.
It's super interesting. Yeah, because that's the thing that messes it up. If you're playing a game that's all about seduction and manipulation.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of this idea of love as like a cleansing agent, but it is, and that's lovely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, my ending, without giving anything away, isn't as tragic as Dangerous Liaisons, because I guess what he's referring to is the fact that in Dangerous Liaisons it leads to the complete downfall of the two aristocrats and death, and because they're obsessed with being in control and they lose control. But that was very interesting because I think Sophia feels, because I've met people like Sophia, and she kind of feels that she can manipulate people, but you can't predict people. You can try to control people. Sorry, and there are obviously lots of situations where that occurs, but like human nature is always one of surprises, I guess, and nobody's predictable, and people have so many layers. And Sophia, as the book goes on, because she is a bit cynical, she sort of underestimates Eleanor. She just thinks, oh well, I found this nice woman and she's in her boring relationship, so she won't really notice if we play this game and I've got this other thing going on underneath. But Eleanor is obviously a rich and complex person with lots of dimensions to her, and I think Sophia fails to understand that at first, that she kind of dehumanizes her a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. There are some steamy bits in this book. Were those challenging to write?
No, they were the best bits to write.
Fabulous.
Because some years ago, when I was like really, really broke and suddenly had this financial crisis, so it was just really funny because I had this rumor about these authors who were writing like they were like a literary imprint, writing quite highbrow books, and then they were making money by writing erotica and self-publishing it on Amazon in their spare time. Which of course is like a tradition that's occurred before, because you've got like Henry Miller and a nice Nin doing that in America in the 50s, because they also ran out of money and had this problem. So I set about doing this, and actually I didn't really make any money because the goal, it's like often with these bubbles they burst quite quickly, and by the time I came on, it was a bit later in the day, and there were like thousands of people putting their awful erotica onto Amazon and competing to sell it and making like about £50. But in the process of doing it, I think I felt I learned quite a lot about what makes a good sex scene, and I think a lot of it is about anticipation and foreplay as much as anything, and building the tension and the chemistry, all those little moments of frisson before something finally happens, the literary foreplay, if you like. But no, I felt they were quite kind of fun to do, and also you've got this kind of, there's so many things going on in each sex scene, in that you've got risk and fear and desire, and Eleanor going up into Finn's room and wondering, is he going to find out? And in one scene, he suddenly hears a noise from below, and he's like, oh, I'm going to get up and find out who it is. And she's scared that he's going to put the light on and see her. So there's like a slight French farce element going on in that as well, as much as a thriller.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. Well, I think it would be really lovely to hear some of the book.
Okay, great. Yes.
Is there anything that we need to know contextually before you read to us?
Yes. So I've chosen a scene where Sophia and Eleanor meet at the Ivy in Wimbledon, and they're just there really for a friendly lunch. In theory, they're just sort of chatting away. And then they just start talking about children's stories that they enjoyed as a kid, and they bring up Roald Dahl. And that's where this extract begins. They just start chatting about, reading Dahl as a child, and then things unfold from there.
My favourite was Roald Dahl, Sophia said. Seriously, J.K. Rowling has nothing on him. I love Dahl as well. Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, Danny the Champion of the World. I long to have a father like his, I added wistfully. Oh yes, me too. This surprised me. I'd pictured Sophia as a daddy's girl with a wealthy, indulgent father. I nearly asked her what he was like, but held back, a little shy. Dahl's short stories were good too, I mused. The one about the woman who kills her husband with a joint of lamb. And what about that story in Switch Bitch, Sophia exclaimed, where those husbands secretly sleep with each other's wives? Oh my goodness, I cried. Yeah, that was juicy, that one. How did it end? Did the wives find out? I can't remember, Sophia replied, her finger circling the rim of her glass. I think it was first written for Playboy. It's a male fantasy, really, isn't it? But it's one of those stories that makes you think it would be so much fun to try it in real life. It would be wild but doable. What, you want to wake up next to another man in your bed? No, Sophia laughed. I mean the reverse, the feminist version. Her eyes flashed, where the women trick the men and sleep with them without them realising. I frowned, wondering why on earth she would want to sleep with anyone except her delicious husband. Did Finn like the underwear you bought? I blurted out without thinking. She looked taken aback, and I wanted to kick myself. Now she was going to think that I'd been imagining them in bed together. She swallowed. Sorry, I was being really nosy. Oh, not at all, she insisted, but she seemed to be holding back, and I felt pervy, intrusive. I just haven't had a chance to wear it yet, she said, averting her eyes. An awkward silence. I had succeeded in neutering my crush on Finn, just about. The only slip had been a dream about him the other night. I had found myself falling off the wagon, Googling him again. You know, Sophia said slowly, we're the same height, the same build. Yeah? I wondered if she was about to suggest a clothes swap, just like the men in Switch Bitch. I looked up abruptly at her. I had thought that she was berating me for desiring her husband. Now I realised that she had another agenda all along. Are you suggesting? No, she couldn't be. She's drunk, I thought, as she smiled at me impishly. She's joking, surely. Why not? She shrugged. Uh-huh. I'm serious. You want me to sleep with Finn and you want to sleep with Adam? In the dark, without them knowing, in secret. They'd know, I exclaimed. It would be impossible to pull off in real life. I mean, it's just a story. But you have a blackout blind. When had she seen that? When they'd come for dinner? Has she been plotting, thinking about it, even back then? If it's pitch black, how could he ever see? Sophia went on. I could get one installed too. I could say to Finn that I got the idea from you, that we'll enjoy beautiful sleep. I laughed out loud at the outrageousness of it all, wishing I wasn't so tipsy, my intuition blurred. Was she testing me in some way? Was this all another game to find out if I wanted Finn? For a start, I pointed out, Adam knows my scent. It's a very particular thing, the scent of someone's body. And then there's all these little habits, the way I sleep, the way I breathe when I sleep, everything. The scent part is easy, she asserted, her pupils dilated. It's an amalgamation of perfume, body wash, shampoo, food, washing powder. That would be easy to fix. I started, realising that she'd been thinking this through. I pictured her slipping into bed beside Adam, her mouth on his, and felt a cut of jealousy. I just can't believe he'd be fooled, I said firmly. But don't they say that the perfect crime... Crime, I laughed. Crime, she laughed too, then added in a deadly serious tone. The perfect crime is just about attention to detail. If we considered every little possibility, wrote a list, ticked them off. I just don't think it would work even then, I said.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that was the perfect passage to read.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Very tantalizing. So you mentioned that you have another thriller in the works. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So that will be coming out next year. And I've done my first draft and given it to my editor, and she liked it, but just got edits to do. So it's called, well, the working title is Watch Me, Watch You.
Ooh, that's good.
A lot of my titles get changed by publishers, but I've got this one for now. So the switch was originally called Switch Kiss because I was playing on the Roald Dahl. And then my agent called it In the Dark, and then my publisher decided it was the Switch. So titles often change, but for now it's called Watch Me Watch You. And all credit to my partner because he thought up this title. So it's about voyeurism and stalking, and it revolves around an apartment. It's about someone who is from, again, I'm playing with themes of class because that is always of interest to me. Someone like from a really poor background who inherits an apartment worth a lot of money in Kensington because she's cared for an old woman before she's passed away. And so she starts working in publishing as an intern, and she has this terrifying and charismatic boss who wants to rent out her apartment for the occasional night. There is, of course, the classic film that inspired this, so I should make a nod to that. So she wants to rent it out, but the intern, Alice, there's a secret room in the apartment, and she discovers that she can watch what's going on. And so she's desperate for money in renting her apartment out to her boss and a few other people, but she can actually see what's unfolding and what's being played out, whether they're having affairs or whatever secrets that are going on. And then she's in possession of that knowledge. And so it's also about sort of games of lies and deceit and sex.
Excellent.
Similar themes, yeah.
Well, fabulous. So where can people find you? How can they keep up to date with what's going on and this book and your next book and everything else?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram. I am on Twitter too. You can find me on Twitter, but I'm not so, like, everyone's kind of left Twitter these days. So do you find that?
I'm still on there, but yes, it's getting lonelier and lonelier.
Oh.
I've curated such a nice Twitter follow. I love the people that I follow because I'm really immersed in book Twitter. So I find it very clever. I avoid anything to do with politics, and I quite like it. And I find people are really still quite clever and funny. But yeah, there's very few people left.
Oh, that's a shame, isn't it?
I agree. Yes.
So I'm on Instagram as Lily Samson author, and that's where I'm doing most of my posting at the moment.
Perfect. Well, I will include a link to that and to your Twitter, and so people can find you very easily. Thank you so much, Lily. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you again to Lily Samson for such a fun conversation. You can find Lily at Lily Samson Author on Instagram and Lily Samson Books on Twitter. Thank you again for listening to this season of Storytime in Paris. I've loved the books we've read this season, and I'll be back with a short mini season this summer with some perfect summer reads. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't yet so you never miss an episode. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.